I never imagined my life could split open in a single moment, but it happened the day a stranger arrived at my door asking about a debt I never created. That was the moment the truth spilled out. The betrayal, the forged signature, the danger I never saw coming from the very people I once trusted most. Pain has a way of carving its lessons deep, and mine cut straight through the quiet life I thought was secure. I stood there on my own porch, holding a future that suddenly felt unrecognizable, and realized the hardest battles are the ones fought within your own home. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from all over the world. Your comments create a community where storytelling thrives, and we're so grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a journey that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hale, though most people in Charleston have called me Maggie for as long as I can remember. At 60 years old, I have learned to appreciate the kind of quiet that settles around a life after decades of working, raising a child, and healing from the loss of a husband who carried my heart through half of my adulthood. My days follow a gentle rhythm now, and I have come to treasure that rhythm more than I ever expected. I live alone in a weathered Victorian house that has stood on its corner for more than a century. Its porch wraps around like a familiar embrace, and the tall windows catch the warm South Carolina light in a way that makes the walls glow each afternoon. Every morning begins the same way. I brew a pot of coffee, open the porch door, and step out to greet the hydrangeas I planted years ago. Their colors shift with the seasons, and I have grown fond of how they seem to change without rushing. When the air is cool enough, I take a slow walk toward the Cooper River, following the same path through the cobblestone streets, passing homes with shutters painted in soft blues and greens. In the afternoons, I either sit in the Charleston Public Library or join the women at the Church Fellowship Hall, where conversations drift from recipes to grandchildren to whatever news the town has decided is worth repeating. My finances are modest but stable. I spent more than 30 years as a head nurse, saving every extra dollar because that was what life demanded. My husband passed young, leaving me to raise our son alone. That responsibility shaped me, deepened me, and still sits in the center of my heart even now. Daniel, my son, is 35 and works in real estate in Atlanta. He moved away more than a decade ago and calls when he remembers, which is usually when something in his life has begun to wobble. His wife, Brooke, has always been polite on the surface, though I have felt her quiet dismissal, as if age had turned me into an outdated version of a person. Still, I have my peace. At least, I had it until that Sunday afternoon when the sky darkened in a way that hinted at more than just rain. The air felt heavy, as though it carried a secret. I was preparing a simple supper, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, when the sudden screech of brakes tore through the calm. The sound startled me enough that I set the wooden spoon down and wiped my hands on a cloth. Something in my chest tightened, not in fear, but in that strange instinct that rises after years of reading people and reading life. I walked to the front hall, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet the way they always do, and reached for the door. What waited on the other side would change everything, though in that moment, with my hand on the brass handle, I still believed I was opening the door to an ordinary evening. I had no idea that the peace I had spent years building was about to crack open, nor that the next chapter of my life was already standing on my front porch, waiting to break the silence. If you're still watching, and this moment hits you harder than you expected, comment number 1 below so I know you're still with me. Now let's move on to chapter 2. Things are about to shift in ways you won't see coming. The moment I opened the door, the wind from the approaching storm pushed against my back, but the real disturbance was standing on my porch. Daniel looked as if he had driven through the night without stopping, his shirt wrinkled, his hair damp with sweat, and his eyes flicking around as though danger had followed him all the way from Atlanta. Brooke stood slightly behind him, clutching her designer bag with trembling fingers, trying to hold herself together while her mascara smudged at the corners. Their presence felt jarring against the calmness of my old Charleston home, as if they had carried chaos in with them. Before I could ask a single question, Daniel brushed past me into the house. His shoulders were tight, his breathing uneven, and the sharp sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floors instantly shattered the quiet I had spent the whole day soaking in. Brooke followed more slowly, pausing in the hallway as though she was afraid the walls themselves were judging her. The air felt heavier with every second, and a hush settled over the house, the kind that comes right before something breaks. I closed the door gently and walked toward the kitchen, where Daniel had already taken a seat at the table. Without a greeting, without the smallest attempt at warmth, he dropped a thick stack of papers directly in front of me. The sound echoed through the room. I stared at the papers, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten even before he spoke. His voice cut through the silence, strained and sharp as a blade. "This is Brooke's debt. $500,000. I need the money by tomorrow." The words just seemed to hang in the air, unreal, impossible, refusing to make sense. For a moment, I could only blink, as if my mind refused to let the number in. Brooke stepped forward then, clearing her throat softly. She began explaining how her online fashion company had collapsed, how investors had backed out at the worst possible moment, and how creditors were threatening lawsuits that could ruin both their reputations. Her tone carried a practiced calm, but her eyes darted nervously and her hands kept twisting the strap of her handbag. I'd heard enough complicated stories in my years as a nurse to sense when something was being softened or cleverly reshaped, and everything about her explanation felt thin. Inside me, a deep ache unfurled. I looked at Daniel, hoping for some trace of the boy I had raised, the boy who used to run barefoot through our backyard laughing at fireflies. But I did not find him in the man sitting across from me now. Instead, I met entitlement, impatience, and the silent expectation that I would, as always, pick up the broken pieces for him. He began reminding me of every time I had stepped in to help him through life. Tuition bills, his wedding, the down payment on his first home, listing them as if they were debts I still owed. I felt myself shrinking inside my own kitchen. Brooke avoided my eyes, Daniel's leg bounced with restless agitation, and I suddenly understood that something much deeper than business failure was at play. Their anxiety carried a frantic edge, the type that does not come from ordinary financial trouble. As I rested my hand on the stack of papers, the weight of their expectations pressed down on me. The number on those pages had the power to destroy the quiet life I had built. And as I sat there, listening to the storm roll closer outside, I felt an unsettling certainty settle into my bones. This was only the beginning of something far more devastating than either of them had admitted. If you're still watching and feeling the tension building, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following every twist. Now get ready. Chapter 3 uncovers something that changes everything. The house felt foreign once Daniel and Brooke settled into the living room for the night. The soft buzz of the old ceiling fan, usually comforting, now sounded like a warning turning slowly above my head. I sat alone in the kitchen long after the lights in the front room dimmed, staring at the stack of papers Daniel had slammed onto my table. The number written across the top still echoed in my mind, refusing to soften or shrink. $500,000. It pressed against my chest like a weight I could not lift, and no matter how deeply I breathed, it did not ease. Daniel had spent the evening circling the same message, speaking as though my helping him was a natural fact of the world. He spoke about responsibility and family, but beneath every word sat a quiet certainty that I owed him. It hurt more than I expected. I raised him alone after his father passed, working double shifts, saving every penny I could. I had believed that once he became a man with a life of his own, he would appreciate the sacrifices. Instead, he still looked at me as the person who would pick up whatever he dropped, no matter how heavy. Brooke had not helped ease the sting. She sat across the table earlier, fingers tapping her phone nervously, offering explanations laced with condescension. She said the debt came from modern financial structures that people my age could not possibly understand. She talked about leveraging assets, the potential of the market, and how everything would have been fine if luck had not turned against them. The implication was clear. I was old, outdated, and expected to hand over my stability simply because their plans had failed. I felt myself unraveling under the weight of their expectations. I had lived most of my life carrying others, but something inside me was beginning to shift. Maybe it was age, or wisdom, or exhaustion, but I could no longer bend without feeling the fracture. I sat in the kitchen long after the last sound died down, trying to steady my breath. My hands were restless, moving without direction, until finally I reached for the small stack of mail resting on the hallway table. Most of it was ordinary, catalogs, utility bills, but one envelope, thick and official, caught my eye. I realized I had seen it days earlier and set it aside. I opened it now, the paper scratching softly as I unfolded it. At first, the words did not register. It was a notice about a line of credit opened under my name 6 months earlier. I frowned, reading the sentence twice, then 3 times. The document included a scanned version of my signature. It looked almost perfect. Almost. A cold tremor moved down my arms. I had not signed anything in years. I knew that with absolute certainty. I touched the printed signature as if I could feel the truth of it, but all I felt was the chill rising through me. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, a clerical error, a mix-up common in large institutions. Yet my instincts, sharpened by decades of reading faces and crises, whispered a different truth. I thought of Daniel's frantic arrival, Brooke's trembling hands, the evasive details about the failed business. A picture began forming in my mind, one I did not want to see. The debt on my table was not a sudden disaster. It was the final stage of something that had been unraveling for months, perhaps longer. As I sat there with the letter in hand, the kitchen dim around me, I felt the first sharp sting of betrayal. The realization settled slowly, painfully, as I folded the letter with shaking fingers. This was more than financial trouble. This was personal. And when morning came, nothing between us would be the same. If you're still here, and that discovery shook you even a little, comment number 3 so I know you're with me. Now, let's step into chapter 4, where the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Morning light filtered weakly through the kitchen curtains, but it did nothing to quiet the unrest inside me. I had barely slept, and when I did, my dreams twisted into fragments of signatures I had never written and debts I had never owed. When I rose from bed, my legs felt heavier, as if the weight of the discovery from the night before had settled into my bones. The house, usually a comforting place to wake into, felt cold and strained, as though it too sensed something had gone terribly wrong. Daniel and Brooke were already awake, sitting stiffly in the living room with the unease of people waiting for news they feared. I carried the bank letter in my hand, the creased paper trembling slightly between my fingers. I stood before Daniel and held out the notice. His eyes flicked to it, then away, almost as if the ink on it burned. I asked him calmly why there was a line of credit under my name, opened months ago. He reached for the explanation he always chose when cornered, calling it a mistake and insisting banks made errors all the time. The defensiveness in his voice sliced through any hope I had that this was a misunderstanding. Before he could continue, Brooke leaned forward. She spoke with that overly smooth tone that always tried to hide her irritation. She said older adults often misinterpret digital processes, and that signatures could be confused by automated systems. She dismissed the letter with a small wave of her hand, as if the problem were no larger than a misplaced receipt. Her attempt to minimize it only deepened the knot forming in my stomach. I knew my own signature. I knew what I had signed and what I had not, and I knew when someone was lying. I stepped away from them because I needed clarity more than I needed their reassurances. I went to the kitchen and called the bank directly. The representative on the line was polite but unyielding. The application had been submitted online. It had originated from an address in Atlanta. A scanned signature had been provided to activate the account. I felt something inside me tilt as the last of my doubts dissolved. This was not an error. Someone had pretended to be Mickey. Overwhelmed, I reached for someone I trusted, a friend from church who worked as a paralegal. I explained the notice, the signature, the fact that the credit had been opened months earlier without my knowledge. She did not hesitate. She told me plainly that what I described was potential identity theft and financial exploitation of an elderly person, a phrase that settled over me like a cold shadow. Hearing it put into legal terms made the truth impossible to ignore. When I returned to speak with Daniel, I tried again to remain calm. I told him what the bank had confirmed and how serious it was. Instead of hearing me, he lashed out with anger, accusing me of mistrust and acting as though I were abandoning him. He painted himself as a victim of my supposed lack of faith, twisting my concern into betrayal. I felt something inside me ache. I had stood by him through every stumble of his life, and yet here he was turning my protection into a weapon against me. The pressure in the room grew unbearable. I stepped outside for a moment, letting the Charleston breeze move around me, hoping it would carry away the heaviness pressing against my heart. As I stood there, I understood with sudden clarity that reasoning with them would not save me. The moment I walked back inside, I looked at Daniel and Brooke sitting in my living room as though it already belonged to them, and I knew this was the last time guilt would guide my choices. If you're still watching, and the weight of this moment is hitting you too, comment number 4, so I know you're holding on. Now let's move into chapter 5, where the storm finally breaks open. The next morning began with a heaviness that felt older than my bones. I woke before the sun rose, lying still in the quiet, listening to the unfamiliar tension pressing through the walls of my own home. The house had never felt small before, but now it seemed to contract around the weight of everything I had learned. Daniel and Brooke moved restlessly in the living room, their low whispers drifting down the hallway like a reminder that time was running out for them, and apparently for me as well. I dressed slowly, trying to steady myself before stepping back into the storm. When I opened the front door to collect the mail, the air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of the previous night's rain. I flipped through the envelopes without much thought until one caught my eye, stamped with bold lettering and an urgency that made my pulse quicken. It was a formal debt collection notice addressed directly to me. The language inside was cold and final, outlining consequences, deadlines, and actions that could be taken against me if the sum was not paid. Reading it felt like watching a trap snap shut. The problem was no longer something whispered between family members. It was now carved into legal paper, threatening to swallow everything I had built. Only a few hours later, a firm knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find a man in a tailored suit standing on my porch, holding a folder. He introduced himself with practiced politeness, saying he needed to discuss the outstanding balance linked to my name. His voice was calm, but there was no warmth in it, only business. The expression in his eyes left no room for denial. I felt a tremor run through me, a fear that came not from physical danger, but from the realization that my financial safety, my future, was already slipping away. He handed me his card and walked off with the efficient ease of someone who had done this many times before. That visit broke whatever illusion remained. My situation was not a misunderstanding, nor a simple family dispute. It had become a matter of legal consequence. My hands shook as I dialed the number of an attorney who specialized in elder financial exploitation. When I arrived at her office, I laid everything on the table: the debt notice, the bank letter, and the details of what Daniel and Brooke had told me. She reviewed every page with a seriousness that made my stomach twist. Her findings were devastating. Multiple documents indicated that my information had been used repeatedly, not just once. Some of the associated debts were tied to a lender currently under federal investigation, and the man who visited my home earlier that day was not merely a collector, but a private investigator working alongside attorneys representing other victims. Each revelation struck like a blow, confirming that my identity had been misused in ways far beyond anything Daniel or Brooke had admitted. I listened in silence, trying to understand how my life had veered into such dangerous territory without my knowledge. When I returned home, Daniel immediately confronted me, demanding an answer as though I owed him one. His desperation came out as anger, sharp and unfair. Brooke hovered behind him, muttering excuses and insisting everything would be fine once I helped them get through this. Their words collided with the truth I now carried, forming a storm inside my chest. For years I had stepped in, believing love meant rescuing. But now, as they pushed and pressed, something in me cracked open. Instead of breaking, I hardened. I looked at them, two adults who had walked into my home with their crisis and placed it squarely on my shoulders, and I felt a shift take a root in the quiet center of my being. I knew then that I would not give them the money. I would not sacrifice the rest of my life to fix what they had knowingly broken. I would protect myself, even if it meant standing against my own son. As the room filled with tension, I stepped back and felt the final pieces of denial fall away. Everything familiar had shattered, and there was no turning back. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the house felt unnervingly still, as if it were holding its breath along with me. The quiet did not soothe me the way it once had. Instead, it pressed against my chest, reminding me that the explosion of the previous day had not resolved anything. It had only exposed the truth I had tried to avoid. I lay there for a few seconds, gathering the strength to face what felt like another long step into territory I never imagined I would enter with my own child. I met with the attorney again shortly after sunrise, driving through streets still wet from the night's rain. Her office felt colder this time, not because of the temperature, but because of the reality waiting for me in her calm, steady gaze. I explained everything that had happened since our last meeting, including the collector's visit and Daniel's insistence that I hand over my savings. She listened carefully before folding her hands and laying out the two paths before me, each as heavy as the other. The first was the path of silence. I could avoid legal reports, cash in my retirement, mortgage my home, and cover the debt that did not belong to me. Daniel and Brooke would escape the consequences for now, though nothing guaranteed they would not return with another crisis, larger and more dangerous. The second path was to file a formal report, protect my finances, and cooperate with investigators. Doing so would expose the forgery, the misuse of my identity, and the illegal connections woven into the debts. That path would almost certainly bring legal repercussions for Daniel and Brooke. I listened to her explain the details, but inside me, something far more emotional was unraveling. I felt myself pulled between two versions of motherhood, the one that rescues without question and the one that understands rescue is not always love. Memories drifted through my mind like a silent film. Daniel as a baby asleep on my chest, Daniel as a boy waving his report card, proud of the smallest gold star. Daniel as a teenager who leaned on me after heartbreak. The years I worked until my feet throbbed just to keep us afloat. Every memory a reason to protect him, and yet every memory also a reminder of how often I placed myself last. The attorney's voice drew me back. She warned that if I helped now, without boundaries, I would expose myself to repeated exploitation. Others could find their way to me, using the vulnerability Daniel and Brooke had already breached. It was not just this crisis I was being asked to absorb. It was every crisis that might follow. I breathed in deeply, feeling a new kind of clarity settle inside me. For the first time, I asked whether there was a way for Daniel to face consequences without losing everything. The attorney said cooperation could help him significantly. Her answer gave me the smallest measure of peace, a reminder that accountability and compassion did not have to be enemies. When I returned home, I found Daniel pacing, demanding an answer. His urgency no longer clouded my judgment. I heard his words, but they did not sway me anymore. A quiet resolve took root in the place where fear had lived. I knew my choice. I would protect myself. I would give him a chance to stand up, but I would no longer carry him. As I walked away from him, I understood that this decision would reshape both our lives. Yet, for the first time, I felt the strength of choosing myself. If you're still here and the choice she faced made your heart tighten even a little, comment number 6 below to stay with me. Now let's transition into chapter 7, where consequences begin to land hard. I woke the next morning with an unfamiliar feeling in my chest, something heavy but steady, like a stone pressed into place. The decision I had made the day before had changed the air around me. The house felt sharper, the silence more defined. I knew the day would bring consequences I had spent my entire life trying to spare my son from. Still, I rose with the understanding that choosing myself did not make me unloving. It made me honest. Just after 9, I heard the knock. It was firm, professional, without hesitation. When I opened the door, 2 officers and a legal representative stood on the porch, their presence calm and respectful. They asked for Daniel and Brooke. I stepped aside, my stomach curling, as they walked past me into the living room. Daniel stood up from the sofa in confusion, and Brooke clutched her handbag like a lifeline. Watching them face the documents they had feared felt like watching something break in slow motion. Daniel first tried to argue. He said there must be a mistake, that the papers were sent to the wrong address, that someone else was responsible. The officers remained steady, explaining each detail with a cool professionalism that left no room for denial. When Daniel saw the proof laid out in front of him, the reality drained the color from his face. The shock settled into him slowly, as if his body fought to reject what his mind already knew. Eventually, his outrage faded into a hollow silence I had never seen in him before. Brooke reacted differently. Before the officers finished their explanation, she shifted blame toward Daniel, insisting she had only followed whatever he signed, claiming she never fully understood the applications. I watched her carefully, noticing the way fear tightened her jaw and made her voice tremble. Her polished calm had cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. It was clear she recognized the seriousness of the accusations, and it terrified her. As the documents were served, the life they had built around image and ambition began to unravel. Daniel received notice that his real estate company had suspended him pending investigation. His professional license might be revoked. Brooke would face direct scrutiny, especially for the applications she had signed herself. Their world, so carefully curated, was collapsing in front of me. My heart ached in ways I cannot fully describe. Watching my child suffer felt like swallowing shards of glass, yet beneath the grief was a steady certainty. I understood now that love was not shielding him from the consequences of his own actions. Love was refusing to let him continue down a path that harmed us both. I thought of him as a little boy, holding my hand at the playground, trusting me to guide him. The memory stung, but it also reminded me that guidance sometimes meant stepping out of the way. When the officers finally left, the house felt strangely empty, not because Daniel and Brooke remained inside, but because something else had vacated the space, the illusion that I alone could prevent this outcome. The tension slowly settled, leaving behind a mixture of sorrow and an emerging sense of peace. I sat down at the dining table, letting the quiet gather around me. The damage was undeniable, but so was the necessity of what had happened. I breathed deeply, accepting that letting consequences fall was the only way to protect both myself and whatever future remained between us. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faintest sense of my life returning to me. The morning after the officers left, the house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves were recovering from what they had witnessed. I woke with an exhaustion that did not come from lack of sleep, but from emotional weight. The quiet inside the rooms was not peaceful the way I once cherished. It was the quiet that follows a storm, when everything lies scattered and unfamiliar. I moved slowly, feeling each step as though I were learning to inhabit my own home again. As I stood in the kitchen brewing my coffee, the ache in my chest deepened. I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been avoiding. My heart was fractured in ways I had never expected, not only because of the financial betrayal, but because the person who had wounded me was the same child I once protected with every ounce of strength I had. I let the grief rise, not fighting it this time. It was time to feel it, to understand it, and let it move through me. I called my friend from church, the same woman who guided me when all of this first began. Hearing her steady voice reminded me that I was not alone. She spoke to me with the kind of clarity and kindness I had missed in my own home. Her reassurance settled me enough to take my next steps with purpose. I realized I could not live in reaction anymore. I needed to rebuild. Later that afternoon, I met with a financial counselor who walked me through the process of protecting what remained of my security. We froze my credit, strengthened my accounts, and combed through every record to ensure nothing else had been touched. With each precaution we set in place, I felt a small piece of control returning to me. The fear that had taken root inside me began to loosen. When I returned home, I knew I had to speak with Daniel privately. I did not intend to save him, but I wanted to give him one chance to cooperate, one chance to turn toward accountability instead of denial. I told him plainly that this was the only path forward. His expression shifted between anger and something that almost resembled regret. Almost. It was impossible to tell which feeling truly belonged to him. Brooke, on the other hand, refused any ownership. She insisted she had been misled, painting herself as a victim of circumstances. The more she spoke, the more I recognized how deeply she relied on manipulation. Her words no longer moved me. I asked them both to leave my home for the time being. It was the hardest sentence I had ever spoken, but it was necessary. When the door closed behind them, the air felt lighter, as though the house finally had room to breathe again. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the light fade across the street. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to calm. The path ahead would be slow and painful, but I could see it clearly, and I knew I had the strength to walk it. If you're still watching and feeling the shift toward healing, comment number 8, so I know you're walking this final stretch with me. Now let's move into the ending, where everything finds its resolution. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly returned to a gentler version of itself. Sunlight stretched deeper across the floors each morning, and the rooms regained the quiet rhythm I had missed. I moved through my days with a steadiness I had not felt in months, beginning to claim my routines again. Coffee on the porch, walks by the Cooper River, afternoons at the library. The peace felt different now, not fragile, but earned. Updates from my attorney arrived regularly. Each one lifted a bit more of the weight I had carried. The fraudulent accounts were traced, the forged documents verified, and I was officially cleared of all responsibility. My financial protections remained in place, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the ground beneath me again. There was relief, but also grief for what had been lost. Daniel's situation shifted slowly. He agreed to cooperate with authorities, a decision I knew he made partly because of the conversation we had before he left. His cooperation reduced the severity of his consequences, but he was not spared entirely. Mandatory restitution, financial education programs, and professional penalties became part of his new reality. It was painful to hear, yet I sensed something changing in him, a softening, a recognition that he needed to grow. Brooke chose a different path. She continued deflecting blame, refusing responsibility for her role. The consequences for her were harsher, and soon she distanced herself from Daniel entirely. I felt no satisfaction in it, only a quiet understanding that some people choose to remain unchanged. One evening, a letter arrived from Daniel. Inside was a handwritten apology, halting but sincere. He acknowledged the harm he caused without excuses and expressed a hope to rebuild trust one day. Reading it brought both ache and warmth. I did not forgive him in that moment, but I allowed the possibility of healing to exist. I placed the letter gently inside a drawer, not discarded, not displayed. It was a reminder that boundaries and grace can exist together. As I sat on the porch watching the sky fade into evening, I breathed in the calm that had finally returned. My life was mine again, and I intended to live it fully. The evening settled softly over the neighborhood as I sat on my porch, the same place where so many of my days began and ended. The light stretched across the quiet street in warm shades of gold and lavender, colors that felt gentle enough to rest in. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully present in myself, steady, calm, and no longer bracing for the next blow. The air carried a sense of completion, though nothing about this journey had been simple. I let my thoughts drift through everything that had happened: the shock of the debt, the discovery of my forged signature, the painful realization that my own son had allowed my life to be pulled into danger. I remembered the fear of legal threats, the heartbreaking moment when officers served documents in my living room, and the long days afterward when I had to choose between protecting my child and protecting myself. Each memory carried weight, but they no longer crushed me. Instead, they reminded me of what I survived. I understood now that motherhood did not mean surrendering my sense of self. Loving a child and losing oneself in that love are not the same. Setting boundaries had not made me cold or uncaring. It had made me whole again. I thought about how many women my age slip into the background, underestimated or taken for granted. I had been one of them, giving until there was nothing left. Reclaiming my space, my finances, and my peace had been an act of courage. Daniel's letter remained in the drawer inside, not revisited, but not forgotten. It represented a beginning, not a resolution, an acknowledgement that healing would take time and honesty from both of us. As the sky darkened, I rose from the porch and stepped inside. My home no longer felt like a place threatened by fear, but one filled with possibility. I breathed deeply, letting the quiet surround me. The past had hurt me, but it had also remade me. I was stronger now, wiser now, and unafraid to guard my own peace. My life was still mine to live, and I intended to live it fully. Some journeys do not end with triumph or disaster, but with a quiet turning inward, a moment when the heart finally understands what it was meant to learn. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought without witnesses, where strength is not loud but steady, and courage is measured in boundaries reclaimed and peace protected. Life has a way of reshaping us long after we think we are finished growing, offering reminders that renewal is always possible, no matter our age or the weight of what we have endured. In choosing ourselves, we honor every version of who we have been and every hope still waiting to unfold. Thank you for staying with this story. If it moved you, inspired you, or made you think in new ways, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. And if you would like more stories like this, please follow.